Welcome to the Ideas Hour with your hosts David Cameron and Suzanne Zeedyk, exploring big ideas that matter. This series was originally broadcast on Teacher Hug Radio in 2021 and 2022. It is still available in their archive as well as in this format.
We introduced our last program by saying that there was something a bit different about it and that we could keep going with that conversation. So for the first time on the Ideas Hour, we're having a guest back for part 2. Our guest, Richard Gerver, had so much to offer and was so open that the program flew by, and David and I both wanted to continue that conversation. So Richard, welcome back again. And for anyone who missed that first show, I'm going to let David introduce him all over again.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Richard, for coming back. I think I said last time that you were a world-renowned writer and speaker, that you were a highly successful head teacher, and that you were, I think, described as a lovely person, generous, thoughtful, loyal, and despite your remarkable success, you still try to find ways to get back to your roots, to engage with schools and teachers, and to make a difference for young people.
Wow, thanks, Dad. I just want to say to everyone, first of all, thank you for having me back. It's an enormous thrill. And I really apologize for anyone that thought when they turned off the last episode, they'd never have to hear from me again. I feel like Johnny from The Shining. Hi, honey, I'm home.
Okay, I think you're proving my point. We need it twice.
Well, it is fascinating when conversations are rich and have lots of themes to explore. And sometimes you get to the end of a conversation and you just think, I don't want that to stop. And Richard, that was absolutely the case. So what would you say that the big idea that we're going to focus on today is?
For me, as we got to the end of the last conversation, it crystallized, didn't it? What I loved about the conversation was it felt really free form, and we almost came to the point at which we're starting today's episode, which is really going to be about human potential, I think, the importance of human potential, what we as educators can do, even in the restricted system many of us find ourselves in, to maybe highlight how we can champion that potential of each individual young person. So yeah, human potential, I think.
And I think that's absolutely right, Richard. And in a sense, we started off discussing Ken Robinson in the last episode. And we started off with Out of Our Minds, which was really his first book, and then went towards The Passion, which was the one of his later books. And we moved from that whole idea of creativity and his work based on the review work that he'd done. And we moved on to that whole idea of finding your passion, finding your potential. And I think that's really an important step. But would you like to tell our listeners why you think that idea and these approaches matter so much right now?
Sure. I mean, look, for me, I think they've always mattered. I think it's always been, and I remember Ken once saying to me, and I'm sure he said it to others at events and in his writing, that we may well look back on the education age and the way education evolved into its mass form. And for years now, we've talked about the squandering of nature's resources. We've talked about the squandering of so many things on our planet and around the world. But we may well look back on this period of time and realize that actually one of the greatest resources we squandered was human resource, in that we kept developing people in one way and discarding so much potential and opportunity. And the reason I think it matters, Does it matter more? I think we could discuss that almost as a philosophical point for hours, but why it matters so much now, why it's so deeply in focus. And I think particularly in the light of the lived experience of the last few years, not just in terms of a global pandemic, but again, what that's amplified. We're living in an age where our children and our grandchildren's legacy from us could be horrifying. They are going to have to find solutions to the global environmental crisis, to the global health crisis, to the global inequity that has continued to develop because of the way the global economy is playing out. All of these things are legacies that our children will have to take over from us. The socio-ethnic crisis around the globe, all of these things which are interconnected. And the truth is, we are going to have to find rare talent in future generations to find solutions to these generally, without being overly dramatic, these earth-challenging challenges. And that means we need to spread our net as wide as possible. And so just to continue to filter the education system down one route, believing that the future continues to lie in efficiency rather than actually a broader context of what that purpose may be, will limit the potential of mankind to solve the problems that challenge our very future. So maybe that sounds a bit grandiose, but it's something that I'm deeply passionate about, and I know stems from Ken's passion, that belief that if we're going to find solutions to those global problems, we have to broaden our understanding of what potential is, of what talent is, and how we use education to find and nurture it.
I think that's a wonderful link into so much of the current educational debate, Richard. And I get the sense that Suzanne will shortly take us in a different direction. But just to make the comment, I think we're now into what you describe as an efficient education system, but also, if you like, a reproductive education system, particularly in England, where it's about making people like us through the system. So we manage the knowledge they get, we manage the experiences we get, all of that. And we encourage teacher training, particularly in the new review, not to give people depth and breadth of understanding, but to give them focus and efficiency. And so I think not only your hugely ambitious challenge of educating people to reshape the world, to fix the world, if you like, but also to say, let's widen out what we do so that we're not restrictive and reproductive, but we're creative and that we become multipliers rather than, if you like, subtractors. But Suzanne.
Can I help us to think about these ideas beyond education for a moment, to really ground them, because Richard, you use the word human potential and human resources, and you mean that not just as an administrative system, but truly the resources of humanity. So I find myself thinking about developments in AI, in artificial intelligence. And I do lots of work with early years, and people are increasingly shocked by some of the AI developments in early years, because in Japan, they're now having robots welcome children into early year settings. And in care homes, they're having robots serve meals and provide company to elderly people in care homes. So for me, it's a great example of where is our development taking us to. And for me, it's an illustration of exactly what you're talking about. Do you think that's a good use of our human potential, or is it wasted? I mean, can you have robots fulfill those kinds of connection needs?
I think it's a really powerful point. And I just want to link back both what you've just said and what David was talking about, because I think there is an intrinsic link that is really important in understanding the reflex of the route we continue to go down, whether it's education policy in England or and let's be honest, it's not just England where we're seeing that kind of constant drive for efficiency. And I think AI is an incredible example of this, right? We're living in a world which we knew, we've been, not just people like me, but we've all been banging on about for decades. is changing faster and faster. It's not a new trope. But what we're seeing now, and I think exacerbated by the two major global events of the last decade or so, the global economic crisis, a global pandemic, the rise of digital technology, social media, AI, all of these things have led to a reflex of a perception of a lack of control. And human beings are simply not emotionally designed to live in a world where there's a lack of control. We're used to living in a world where we think we can find levers eventually that will give us back control of everything. So education policy for me is stuck in this kind of purgatory where we seem to think the answer lies in just increasing levels of control. If we create an education system that is about more and more control, if we train teachers to just deliver systems and train children to seek out more and more control, that somehow that focus on that efficiency and those levers will somehow bring us out of this dark era into a kind of new promised land of certainty again. And what you're describing, Suzanne, is exactly the point. You know, many people hear and see what you've just said and go into a state of denial. Oh, it's only happening in Japan. It's only happening here in care homes, in nurseries, right? Much like we did in March 2020, when we all kidded ourselves that the pandemic was exclusively Chinese or Asian, right?
Yep.
You know, or Omicron somehow was suddenly just for South Africa. You know, this idea that we go into this state of denial. And I think what's really, really important is to acknowledge the fact that we will never live in a world where human beings will feel the level of control they have in previous generations or previous decades. Now, things like AI for me offer, yes, they offer huge challenge, and for many they are scary, and you can understand why, frankly. You know,
sure.
That idea that a robot greets a child at a school nursery or sits talking to a person in a care home with mild Alzheimer's, you know, can be extraordinarily threatening to human beings. But it's actually why what we need to be doing, rather than looking at all of these things as threats, is looking at them as opportunities. And that's one of the subtle differences between the way we prepare people to lead lives of certainty and the way we prepare people to live lives of creativity and potential. Now, I'm not saying our reflexes shouldn't be initially one of fear or nervousness or, oh my goodness me, what's this going to mean for us all? But what we need to do is move into a position where we start to ask curious questions. That's interesting. What does that mean for us? What can we do with that? How does that allow us to do other things, rather than immediately kind of, you know, retort into our shell and wait until the whole thing goes away in the hopes that we can come back out and forget it ever really happened. So for me, that idea now is, and why it's so pertinent, and why we have to move away from the model of the myth of control into one of a new world which is opened by curiosity. And so it's about the subtlety of the way we recognize and appreciate it's okay to feel nervous and frightened of these things, but the way to actually come forward and out of those things isn't to retreat, isn't to deny, isn't to hope that it goes away, but to find the courage to spark curious questions.
I think, yeah, and what you've done there, Richard, again, brilliantly, as you did last time, is link us back into ongoing concerns. And this morning, you've done something even more spectacular. You've linked us into the Reith lecture, which I think is going out almost right now, talking about artificial intelligence. So you're making lots of these connections. One of the things that I often think about is that in education, we've got a struggle between King Canute and Keanu Reeves in Point Blank. It's the struggle between the king who thinks he can control the sea and the man who thinks he can learn to surf. And we're still educating on the Canute principle, as you describe it, that we can control and command, whereas we need to move to the Point Blank principle, which is where we ride the waves, because we're not going to succeed by doing anything else. You've linked all of that to curiosity, one of Suzanne's abiding passions. But you've taken us right back in to some of the ongoing themes from the last conversation. you know, we talked about creativity. You used words like authenticity. You talked about love. You talked about truth. You talked about honesty. You talked about respect. And that's very much the language that you use, Suzanne, when you talk about connections. So given the way that this conversation's developed, Richard, is that kind of language still appropriate as we move into this broader and wider discussion?
God, absolutely. You know, I mean, when you think about the terms you've just talked about that we've talked about before, one of the things, again, you know, I think it's always so important to really analyze and understand the lived experience of what we're going through right now, right? And so many of those things are words we're hearing about our political leaders. Now, that's not surprising, and we're not going to turn this into a political discussion. But, you know, the point is, trust, authenticity, love. You know, if you feel those things from people, you are far more likely to trust them. You are far more likely to think actually they've got your best interests at heart. And of course, one of the tragedies we're seeing so much in political conversation and communication at the moment is those things are so seriously lacking. Because again, we're living in a time frame where people think in power, the people who are currently in power think as long as we just tell people what to do or we hide the truth from them, that they'll be malleable. And actually the thing is, as a human species, we are far more sophisticated than that. And particularly with the advent of things like social media, you know, we're not living in an age anymore where the powerful control information. And so we're seeing our natural curiosity actually undermine the power of the leadership, political leadership now, because people are basically, whether they're right or wrong, whether we agree with their views or not, they are using their curiosity to challenge in ways people have never challenged before. And when we're talking about human potential linked to education, there is a very important message for me in this, for us as educators. You know, again, for maybe 20 years or so, a number of us have talked about the importance of authenticity in classrooms and schools, because our children, whether we like it or not, because of the world they live in, wrapped around digital technologies, artificial intelligence, the on-demand culture that we live in right now, are quite possibly, and I use this word deliberately provocatively, probably the most sophisticated generation of consumers the world has ever created. And what I mean by that is they have, and excuse the language, a bullshit detector, right? They sniff out authenticity in ways that previous generations perhaps were never capable of doing. You know, I mean, our young children have always had that superpower. But actually, as we get older, we tend to find that actually we're more and more dubious. We're more and more skeptical. We're more and more curious, actually. Is that the truth? Is that real? What's happening over there? Was there a party at number 10 Downing Street? You know, all of these things, we're far more questioning than ever we were. And that means that as teachers and educators, if we walk into a classroom inauthentic, if we walk into a classroom where we genuinely aren't passionate about the human potential of each of the children in our class, if we walk into a classroom and deliver a lesson that we frankly don't believe in or care about, our children are going to know that more than any previous generation. And so that issues a huge challenge to us in terms of the power and importance of authenticity, of love, of trust, of all of the things we talked about in the last episode. Because I don't know about you, but the greatest teachers I've ever observed throughout my career have always exhibited those behaviors. And that in many ways is the kind of secret sauce of what it takes to be a great educator.
We've got ourselves into a really interesting territory in terms of discussing the way that we're educating young people. And Suzanne took us out from the school context into that much wider context about how we think about the world and how that operates. I'm going to take us back into one of the real, for me, interesting areas of current debate and discussion, and that's around the idea of social mobility. We touched on it in the last program, and I think I talked about the idea that social mobility, as it's perceived here, is much more about making young people like us. It's about putting them on a ladder, that there's a lot to fix thinking around social mobility, and it almost becomes a form of rescue for individual young people rather than change for an entire group. And it seemed to me that that was a view that you were sharing and working towards. Is that fair, Richard?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to be so incredibly careful when we're talking about social mobility, because again, David, for me, the essence is we get trapped in this very kind of narrow thinking about just being efficient, and actually the problem is, in a way, when we look at it in education terms, we think, oh, we just need to be more efficient with kids who are in socially deprived areas or challenging communities or a challenging context. We just have to increase the levels of efficiency with them because we need them all to end up looking like me. We need them all to have exactly the same route, the same journey, the same qualifications, and then everything mysteriously will be okay. And there are two massive problems with that way of thinking. The first, of course, is that that is not any route to success. And again, we could have a whole conversation about perceptions of success. What is it? What does it really mean? How do we want people to be able to look back on their own lives and perceive, have they been successful or not? Because again, the model you're talking about, which is championed so strongly, is about a very narrow vision of what success actually means on a level around human potential. So that's one of the problems. And of course, the other is missing the whole point entirely, which is a lot of those young people who come from challenging circumstances have no context on which to pin any concept of what human potential or success or journey may look like. So it's all very well telling kids that actually the route to utopia is get your qualifications and do your exams, get your head down, work hard in school, do what I tell you. You can go to university, you can get a degree and everything will be fine. But for a lot of those kids, they're still asking the question of, but why? I don't understand what that means. I don't understand what job security means. I don't understand what it means to go to, what is university? Why would it matter to me? And so again, we're missing a whole major point about social mobility, which I may have talked about, forgive me if I'm repeating myself, in the last episode. But for me, there are two key things here when we're talking about social mobility that are the essence of where we need to go as educators. And the first is to help our young people to dream. Right? We need to help our kids to dream, because the problem is kids that come from, advantaged, and I don't mean that with a sneer. I came from I hope all kids eventually come from advantaged backgrounds. I'm not talking about economically. I'm talking about exposure and opportunity to culture, to nature, to books, to conversation. That's what I mean by advantage. And of course, when you come from that kind of background, you're able to dream because you've had experience of exposure to a whole range and raft of things, which allow you to think bigger, right? So the first thing we need to do is help our children who come from challenging environments to dream. Because if they can dream, they can start to think, oh my goodness, that's awe, that's wonder. I'd love to, that's interesting. And then you can spark the curiosity. And then the second layer of that is to build because a dream is a fantasy. And our job as educators, first of all, once we've helped our kids to dream, is then to turn that dream into an aspiration. So in other words, how do we put the rungs on a ladder, which then say to that kid, if that's where you want to go, if that's what you want to be, here are the steps you might need to take to get there. And that's what learning should be about. Now, ultimately, we can't push our kids up those ladders, but we can at least make them tangible and give them the rungs on which they know they can take. Because the other thing is, they may get halfway up and go, actually, that isn't my dream anymore. But that's okay, because my educators will help me build another ladder over here. Or eventually, I'll have the skills, ability, and knowledge to start to build my own rungs on those ladders. But the missing piece in all of it is dream. It's no good to just build schools like factories where we think the answer to social mobility is to pump every child through the same experience and journey, because we're missing the point. Those kids may do it through fear because they trust us, because we tell them that's what they have to do. But actually, we're not giving them a context for the reason to do it for themselves. And ultimately, lifelong learning, life journey is about having aspiration, whatever that might be. And if we don't fire that in our kids first, if we don't fire the dreams, then it's never going to work.
You've linked in, I think, in many respects to John Jones's work, where he identifies teachers as dream weavers. So there's a real pattern, extending the weaver analogy, there's a real pattern beginning to develop here. And interestingly, there's also a pattern that ties into some of the things that I'm obsessed with. When I talk about raising attainment, I often relate it to redefining potential, and drawing on Mick Waters' work as well. I think what we often do in schools is we give children a test of some kind, whether it's an exercise, whether it's a formal test. On the basis of that, we decide on their ability. And just to make sure we get that right, we put them in an ability set or whatever. And having decided that, we then decide what their potential is. So it's not about them finding their potential, it's about us identifying it and then putting them on tram lines. And my argument is that if we don't offer that open-ended opportunity that allows children to surprise us, to take control of that definition of potential, then we run all of the risks that you're talking about, Richard. You know, we run the risk of missing out on those achievements. And it takes me back to Ken Robinson's line of, you know, your daughter doesn't have a problem, she's a dancer. They didn't see that potential, and therefore she was defined as a failure. And it's that breadth, I think, that you're arguing for really strongly. And I'm sure you're touching on lots of areas that Suzanne is particularly interested in. So Suzanne, the opportunity to come back to you.
If I weave in another theme then, what's all this behavior control that goes on in a lot of our system? Because I find myself thinking, if you're trying to control outcomes and dreams, we're also trying often to control behavior. For me, those all come as a set. So can you speak to that, Richard? How do you think behavior control fits with dream control?
I think it's such an incredible question. Again, as a kind of link between what David said and what you said, and going back to the reason why we convened in the first episode, Ken, there's another story he tells, which I absolutely love. And I don't know if you remember it. I think it was in his book, The Element. He interviewed Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons. And, you know, the whole book was predicated on how is it that some people end up living in their element and many miss out? And is there a way we can improve that for people, right? And the story he tells very simply about Matt Groening is Matt, in the interview, turned around to him at one point. He said, you remember, you know, I once had my parents called in to see my art teacher because how disappointed my art teacher was in me. And the quote he used was, the art teacher turned around to his parents and said, if only Matt would stop drawing those damn stupid cartoons, he could actually be quite a talented artist. And it's that whole thing around perception of value, perception of importance. So much of this comes down to the kind of old-fashioned control principle, that old industrial thinking about if all we get right is efficiency, the world will improve, because it's about how do you improve productivity. And of course, the truth is that if all we do is look down one narrow pathway, which is ours, we're not empowering young people. We're not giving them opportunity. What we're doing is forcing them down one narrow perception, which is always going to ill prepare them for the challenges of their future, whatever that future is. And when we talk about behavior, either with a big B or a small b, whether it's about pushing kids down certain channels, or whether it's the whole thing around, you know, we know the hot topic around behavior management in a classroom. You know, the key thing for me, and always has been as an educator, and I think is one of our primary skills of great educators, and one of the primary responsibilities of all educators, is to understand that every action is for a reason. Everything young people do, everything they say, everything they believe in, everything they do dream about or don't dream about, every reaction they give to everything we do has a deep reason which comes from their own humanity. And if what we do is just blindly ignore that and go, no, this is the way, I don't care what baggage you're bringing in today or where you've come from or what your thinking is or what your experience was at the weekend, park all that because here's the truth. We're in a really dangerous environment, but it's an environment that tends to have been the environment that we've operated in within education for a very, very long time. So whether it's about passion or interest or skill or talent or just human behavior, if what we do is continue to believe that there is one route, one answer, and that route and answer and truth is mine, we're going to continue to find people leaving the education system angrier and more disaffected than ever before. It's why I think we're seeing such a significant rise in good people who are becoming increasingly angry and polarized, whether it's politically, whether it's socially, whether it's around a vaccination or the idea of control measures to control a pandemic. I think it's because people are becoming increasingly angry about believing that everybody has to follow the same path and one person's truth. And that for me is the core challenge for us in education, because it's very difficult in a mass education system to accommodate every human being. So rather than try and find ways to that path, what we do is we go, it's far too, a bit like AI for some people, right? It's far too complicated, far too scary. So let's just stick what we've always done and what we've always known. And the problem is, because the world's turning faster and more challengingly, if that's even a word, what we're doing is seeing policymakers and system leaders continually reverting back to the classic idea of sticking fingers in their ears, pretending it'll all go away, and actually that if I shout loud enough and I'm bullying enough about it, my truth will eventually be the truth.
Okay, Richard, we have wandered into some controversial areas, which are always the most interesting areas. So if I unpack a little bit of what I just heard you say, here's a problem. For the folks who believe strongly in behavior control, we have some people who are talking about relationship agreements rather than behavior policies. Okay, for some people, they're just doing what has always been done normally, and they see themselves as giving children something valuable. You need to accommodate the group, you need to turn up on time, you need to turn up with all your things. So if they're listening to this program, they might not recognize themselves in what you just said because they see themselves as giving something of value. So can you speak more to the values, where we get our vision about values? Because I think that is where the discussion lies. And if we could see that, we'll make more sense of some of those arguments.
I think, we could, again, this is an area, Suzanne, I think we could talk about almost at length in probably more than one episode, this whole issue. But, one of the things for me around this is, first of all, a recognition, and unfortunately we do live in a polarized world, and I think that's particularly true tragically at the moment in education, again perhaps amplified by social media, by some deliberate divisiveness from some people around trying to create this kind of polarized debate in education. And as with all things controversial, the truth is we have to take a breath and actually explore the nuance a little bit more. And one of the things I often say to people is anybody who believes they're absolutely right, frankly, needs to be very, very scared of their own emotions. Because the truth is there is no one answer, right? There is no right. There is no, and again, I increasingly fear within some people in the education context that there are people who spend all their life and energy trying to explain to everybody why I'm right and everybody else is wrong. And I think the behavior issue is one of those. So first of all, let me just caveat slightly what I said, because all young people, in fact, all of us, need the protection to know there are rules and systems in place. The one thing we know about young people is anarchy is terrifying, and not just for young people, for all of us. So there is a definite value and importance, not just for children in terms of class management, their behavior management as young people, but actually through life, to understand the need for rules and regulations within systems and societies, right? That's really, really important.
Great. Yep.
So,
that provides safety.
Yeah, exactly. But it's also not just about the safety of me, the safety of us, the idea of responsibility, that actually I'm not just responsible for myself, but my actions and interactions have repercussions for others. You know, again, talking within the very immediate current climate, for example, those people who are still going, and this is a personal view, I'm not going to wear a mask for whatever reason when I go into a shop or a cafe, or right. That to me is exactly an example of the breakdown, because it's not about what I'm doing for me. It's about understanding that sometimes my behaviors and actions have repercussions on others. And so perhaps maybe we need to be very clear about that definition. In terms of behavior, I think what's hugely important is the idea that all of us as educators need to understand that children aren't misbehaving on the whole just to cause chaos or to be disruptive or to be rude. There's always a reason underneath it. And a bit like, you know, we started this conversation around human potential, human behavior, the magic of human uniqueness. We need to be very confident and clear that the answer doesn't lie in one system or structure as to how to manage that young person's behavior. The art form of a professional educator is to truly try and understand the reason for that behavior. Because if we can truly understand the reason for a human being's behaviors, we can start to understand how to knit and manage an education system to meet those needs and ensure we help them develop and flourish. You know, the problem in so much of what we see in behavior management in schools is, and it is true, you know, we can identify some of the most vulnerable young people in terms of their chance they're going to end up institutionalized in a prison or in some kind of penal, penal reform structure by the way they behave at school. But it doesn't have to be that way. But if we ignore the unique challenges those young people are showing us, we're not actually treating the problem. All we're doing is putting a paracetamol down their throat, right? It would be like going to a doctor and the doctor going, look, I don't really care about where you've been or what your problems are. Just take this medicine and you'll be fine. And that medicine is simply a painkiller without truly understanding the cause of the pain. And I think if the great educators, the truly professional educators truly understand that, and what I'd say to teachers is, if you want to take yourself to the next level and truly do your young people justice, please, please, please remember that as a professional, you need to understand the source of the pain, not just the quick cure for it.
So what you're really doing then, Richard, is bringing us back to curiosity. You are arguing that teachers and all members of the education world have a responsibility to be curious about the young people in their care.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
So I would then say, in order to do that, we need to nurture that curiosity. And when the system puts terrible pressures on members of that community, then the capacity for curiosity is decreased. So what do you think we need to do to support teachers' curiosity?
Well,
if I got you to name one thing, what would be a key thing we need to do?
Mutual support and collaboration, Suzanne. At the end of the day, you're absolutely right. And this is not taking aim at teachers, but actually when you're living in a world where you are judged and managed to perform
exactly
efficiency, right? But, and this is crucial, also one of the human reflexes when we tend to feel under pressure, which teachers have done, you know, intensely and increasingly intensely over the last few years, we tend to go into a self-protection mode for all kinds of reasons. Again, I think too complex to draw out here. But one of the things, again, that I think is hugely important is we stick together as a profession. We support each other through mutuality. We encourage one another. We help each other to explore our curiosity by generating questions. So, for example, soft conversations with a colleague you trust about a child in your class who is exhibiting behavior patterns, and just saying, look, I've got child X and this is how child X is behaving. having that mutual support rather than believing, which often we're led to believe as teachers, that if child X is misbehaving, somehow it's my fault. It's my fault as the teacher. And so for me, the one most important thing is do not allow yourself to hunker down, to hide away from your colleagues, to feel shame over a child's misbehavior, to allow yourself to be divided, but to stick together and to support each other's professional curiosity by helping each other ask the right kinds of questions. Because the other thing we know is if we're one step removed from that direct pressure, we are able to see things with a slightly greater level of clarity. And I think the profession right now has never needed that collaborative approach more than it does today.
Wow.
You've touched on so many things, Richard. I mean, you're now, I think, getting into that whole theme of teacher agency, which is such a part of discussions that are going on in education. I loved one of the things that you talked about a while back, which is that we are threatened by two things, certainty and uncertainty. That too much certainty is inhibiting us and too much uncertainty threatens us. So we oscillate between that quest for the certainty on one hand, and we have the fear of anarchy driving us towards that, and curiosity on the other. And one of the other things I've loved is your idea that it's as important to be led by questions as it is to be led by answers. And what we're looking for, I think, in your view, is what I have tended to think about as respectful doubt. And we have too little respectful doubt and too much resolute dismissal. You've referred to a whole number of instances where that's the case, from the anti-vaxxers. You didn't actually mention about QAnon or whatever. You know, that quest for certainty, regardless of how bizarre and how many aliens might be involved in it. And the way that you and Suzanne are using the idea of curiosity as the path through that, I love that. What I really want to do, Richard, is I really just want to absolutely lower the tone right now and take us in a completely different direction. Because one of the things I know about you is that you've had the opportunity to speak to all sorts of people. Your conversation is scattered with names that make me draw my breath in at times. So of all the people that you've met, all the people you've talked about, who's made the biggest impression on you? And tell us a bit about that.
My goodness me. But just so you know, David, the only reason I scatter my conversations with names is because the truth is I have incredibly low self-esteem. And I just think that by telling people I hang out with, I'm just a stalker, really. That by saying to people I just hang out with famous people, that somehow that'll give me some kind of credibility. There are so many that I could genuinely spend all day talking about. But I'm going to talk about the most famous for a number of reasons. One, because meeting this person was the proudest moment in my professional life. And by the way, I've added the word professional in there in recent times because my wife heard me give an interview a while back where I said it was the proudest moment in my life, to which not only did she kick me in a tender place, but reminded me that we had actually met, got married and had 2 children together. And were they not equally as important? So it's very important people know before I name drop that I have added professional life into this. But also because he's he's one of those human beings who to this day, I have no idea how I ever got access to or got the chance to meet. And what he said actually is so profound in its beautiful elegance and simplicity. So a few years ago, in fact, just not long before COVID hit, I got to meet with Barack Obama. And it was a very, very special pinch yourself moment, you know, and a number of things to say about that meeting. The first and most important being, you know, when people say never meet your heroes because they disappoint you. He really, really didn't. He was, and I think what really struck me about him, and I have to say this about some of the most important and extraordinary human beings I've ever met, whether it's people like Manoush Shafiq, who's the former governor of the Bank of England, a remarkable woman. People should look her up. Madam Kasuri, who was the founder of a school system in Pakistan, who's had the courage, despite everything, to ensure that boys and girls get educated in equity. Whichever of these people it is, the one thing they all have in common is this: none of them believe they're right. None of them believe that they, the thing they all have in common is actually their unbelievable curiosity. They would much rather hear about your life than tell you about theirs. Their humility is extraordinary. And when I met him, obviously, he wanted to know about me. And I said to him, look, Mr. President, if you really want to find out about me, because I've only got 10 minutes with you, if you want to go for a beer or a meal anytime, just let me know. I'll give you my mobile phone number. But I've got 10 minutes to ask you a question. So if you don't mind. And he smiled, that ridiculous smile of his. And the question I asked him was this. Like I said, what's the most important thing you learned during your 8 years in the White House? And his answer was so honest. First of all, because it showed vulnerability and it showed learning and it showed real thought. And secondly, because, of course, one of his great gifts is to speak in profound terms in ways that normal human beings like me understand. So he said, well, I'll tell you. He said, when I first arrived in the White House, Richard, I was like a kid in a sweet shop. I was able to surround myself with the greatest technical experts on earth, the greatest economists, the greatest political strategists, scientists, everybody, because when the president of the United States phones up and says, would you, it's very difficult to turn down. He said, but when I reflect on the 8 years and particularly the challenges that crossed my desk in that time, and by the way, for anyone listening to this who's ever had to go through an in-tray exercise as part of an interview, I want you to remember that no matter what people throw at you in that interview for your in-tray exercise, just remember Barack Obama's problems that crossed his desk would have been quite extraordinary. He said, what I realized when I reflect back on those problems is this, that actually virtually none of those challenges were technical by nature. They were human. And when you strip them back, you realize that they were all almost always about love, anger, jealousy, greed, hatred, tribalism, fear. He said, and what I've learned as I've reflected back on those 8 years is our reflex is usually far too quickly to try and find a technical solution to the problems we face, to design ourselves out of challenges and crisis without ever truly reflecting on the human issue underneath it. And I think to an extent, that's something that is such an important thing for us to reflect on as educators, and particularly if we're talking about curiosity, human potential, the future of education, that for too long, our reflex has been far too quickly to try and find the technical answer without really reflecting on the human challenge. And as we come out of COVID in particular, and the shared global lived experience of the last 2 years, if we go quite straight into that reflex of, right, how do we find the technical solution for this? We are going to miss out and do huge damage to the incredible opportunity and potential of the next generation. So there it is, big name drop, but my goodness me, the reason I share that story is, for me, it's one of those extraordinary moments in my life where I've heard somebody say something with such elegance, it's just blown my mind, actually.
You've touched on something really, really germane. In dealing with the pandemic, all our government in the UK can do is talk about the vaccination programme, which is the technical solution to preventing the national health from being overwhelmed. But it is allowing variants, currently it's Omicron or whatever, allowing variants to develop elsewhere because we're not prepared to tackle the wider human problem. We're not prepared to tackle cause. We're only interested in dealing with effect and impact. And while I'm not remotely arguing against the advantages that we've got with the vaccination program, I am making the point that unless we tackle the human problems, and I loved your summary of Obama, tribalism, greed, love all of these things. Unless we begin to tackle these, we're not going to find our way through any crisis. But the ideas that we've begun to develop, just to give us your summary, Richard, of what this should mean for education policy and what you want to see happening in schools with and through teachers.
Well, for me, David, look, the most important thing is hopefully to pull back into this state of simplicity, and to also be very cognizant of, it's very easy for people like me who no longer work day to day in schools to kind of come up with profound thinking and big ideas when the reality still hits that teachers are managed in the way they are, and the expectations are driven the way they are. So I think that what's really important, first of all, is to say to any teacher listening to this, any educator, any teaching assistant, any head, anyone who works with our young people in whatever setting, never to feel guilty about what they can't do or what they're not doing. One of the fears I have when they listen to people like us talk is it can undermine self-confidence in teachers who think, my God, I'm trying to do the very best I can. And actually all that's done is make me feel inadequate. And to say, look, please don't. But really, all you've got to do is allow yourself permission to think big sometimes and not just think on the granular level about function and structure and systems and what I have to do. Don't ever feel guilty about taking half an hour to reflect, to think big. Even if you don't do anything directly with it, your subconscious will change the way you think as a professional and behave. I'm going to go right the way back to 4 simple questions that I've always asked teachers to think about, because I think if you can use the conversations we've had and reflect through these 4 questions, you really are on your way to doing the very, very best you can for young people now and in the future. And actually, they're questions we can share and use in collaboration. So, do I actually know my children? Do I know what my children need? Am I designing learning to meet that need? And how do I know it's working? Now, they may sound trite and simple, but at the end of the day, if we as professionals can challenge each other on those 4 questions, and we can respond with honesty and love and integrity and authenticity, then you are doing the very best you can for the young people in your care in the conditions you're being asked to work in.
As I said right at the start, Richard, before we did these 2 programs, despite your success, you've never acquired arrogance. I think you have a proper humility in the face of the opportunities that you've had. Thanks again for that, Richard.
Thank you so much, David. Honestly, every time you and I get together in physical or virtual realms, I find the experience genuinely fascinating. And that's your gift, your ability to facilitate, to pull the best out of people. And that's inspirational too. And to Suzanne, whose passion and intellect and commitment to what you do, Suzanne, is extraordinary too. So, from me to you, stay safe, stay well, and thank you for everything you do. And for everyone else out there, just thank you. And I hope I get to meet some of you in the future and you can be bored by my rants in person. Anyway, take care, everybody. Thank you very much.
If you would like to hear more from Richard, one of the best recommendations we think that we can give at the end of this program is his TED Talk entitled Finding a Sense of Higher Purpose. And realizing that it was recorded in 2016 is a reminder that he's been thinking for a very long time about how we can best fulfill our human potential.
This has been the Ideas Hour, brought to you by Suzanne Zeedyk and the real David Cameron.